dismissed to go to your class. Have a great class.
Good morning, North Augusta Church. Kind of loud and boomy this morning. Just to remind you, we have several methods for making your contribution if you want to do that. There's a bowl in the back if you want to go old school and drop cash or a check. If you want to mail it in to a P.O. box, we just so happen to have a P.O. box. So you could mail it in there. It's in the bulletin or up on that board. If you want to work out bill pay with your bank, I'm sure they would love to help you with that. But also, if you'd like to use our online giving option, it's at the end of the sermon notes. By the way, there are sermon notes in the YouVersion Bible app because I remembered to do that. So at the end of that, there's a giving link, or you can just go to give.northaugustachurch.org, follow the directions. Last week was Easter, and we spent a lot of time looking at the resurrection and celebrating that. And I hope it was meaningful to you. It was meaningful to me. I don't always do this, but there's a story that I like to go to the week after Easter. And there's some reasons for that, but if I'm being honest, there's another reason for it. I mean, I think it lays in very nicely after even what we talked about last week in Easter. Also, my family and I are going to the beach this week, so and this story takes place on the beach. So all I'm saying is the slides might have been heavily influenced by the beach this week. So I don't normally talk about the pictures, but you might pick up on a theme. The story we're going to talk about comes from the Gospel of John. And it's really interesting to me because if you read the end of John chapter 20, there's 21 chapters in John. If you read the end of John chapter 20, you would think he was done. Like you would think he was finishing at the end of chapter 20. John chapter 20, starting in verse 30, there's not a slide for this. It says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Man, that's a solid ending. Like, if it ended there, we would still talk about how great John was at writing. If I ever write something and it ends that cleanly, I will be really, really happy with it. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a Marvel movie or one of these like this. I'm not going deep into this, just one of the things that they do. We'll save going full geek for another sermon. But most of you know that if you sit through a Marvel movie, it ends, there's the credits, and then there's at least, if not more than one, there's at least one extra scene. The story works fine without it. It usually links you to something that's going to happen later. And it's an interesting practice. It became standard for them. There are some other movies that do that kind of thing. If you were tracing it back in movies, you would find that the first one of those of note was in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, actually, where people, if they happen to be sitting through the credits, Ferris comes out and basically tells them to go home. But it's this extra scene afterwards, and people were like kind of pleasantly surprised, and it was funny. But I'm going to argue that practice doesn't start with Ferris Bueller. I think it actually starts with the Gospel of John, because that's the way the Gospel of John reads. Into chapter 20, man, he ties a bow on it. I mean, that is a solid, solid ending. And so you're a little bit surprised when there's more to read. What I'm saying is Marvel probably owes the Apostle John some money. That's what I'm saying. But pick up in chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Because after he seems to have tied it up, really, really well, here's what he says. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, which means the twin, by the way, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. All right, pause there for a second. So let's walk through the story a little bit. This is after Jesus has died. It's after he's resurrected, and most of these guys know about it. But they're sitting around. He's apparently not right with them. And they're figuring out what to do. I picture them sort of twiddling their thumbs, looking at each other. Nothing new on Netflix. And then they start talking. And Peter's the one that comes up with, "Hey, I know, guys. Let's go fishing." Now, remember, most of these guys were fishermen before Jesus called them. Matter of fact, some of them, Jesus was just walking down the beach. They're mending nets with their dad. Jesus goes, "Hey, follow me." And they go, "Okay." And their dad's like, "Dude, the nets." So most of them had a career in fishing where they were trained as fishermen, though they seem to not be very good at it. Because literally every time you see the disciples fishing in the Bible, they're not catching fish. So here it tells you, so they went out and they fished all night and caught nothing, which is somewhat fascinating. They're fishing with nets. I've been on a shrimp boat one time. I had a friend who owned one. They asked if we wanted to go out. We went on a shrimp boat. If you want to know how that works, it works basically like this. You get on the shrimp boat, you go out in the ocean, they drop a net in the water, and they go around and go around and go around, and you play cards until they pick the net up and dump it on the deck of the boat. I forgot the word deck for a second. The deck of the boat. And then you put on these rubber boots. I'm not sure it works on all shrimp boats like this, but it works on this one. You put on these rubber boots, and basically it dumps all this stuff, and a good bit of it is shrimp, but there are also like crabs and license plates and an old boot, just like in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. All that stuff is true. And so you put on these rubber boots, and you kick everything that's not a shrimp out the side holes of this boat, so it goes back in the water. Except maybe, I'm going to go say, maybe we saved the license plate for scrap metal later and didn't pollute the ocean. But that was it. We dragged a net. There were fish in the ocean. It caught them. So these trained fishermen, trained apprenticed fishermen, go out after they've been following Jesus around, and they fish all night and somehow manage to catch nothing. Now, as the sun is rising, they see a guy on the shore, but they do not realize it's Jesus. The narrator actually tells you that. They don't realize it's Jesus. So, random stranger on the beach from their perspective goes, "Hey, you guys caught any fish?" "Since you ask, no." "I got an idea," random stranger on the beach says. "Have you thought about throwing the net on the other side of the boat?" Now, none of this is said, but having been somebody who's been trying to do something and having somebody else make a suggestion that seems obvious, I can imagine how they felt about that. Not, "Oh, gee, thank goodness somebody came down the shore to tell us to try to throw the net on the other side of the boat. We didn't think of that." But they do. For whatever reason, they do it. And immediately it fills up with so many fish that they have trouble pulling it in. They can't get it into the boat. And then John's the author of this gospel, and he does something kind of cute. He gives himself a nickname so he doesn't have to keep writing his name. And the nickname that he gives himself is the disciple that Jesus loved. He uses that to differentiate between the other disciples. I don't think that means Jesus didn't love them. I just think that when the Holy Spirit inspires people to write, he doesn't override their personality. That's why you get stuff like that. That's why you get in the Gospel of John this super, super weird competition that Peter and John have. Like John really, really wants you to know he can run faster than Peter, and it comes up like a ridiculous amount. And there's always this weird little interaction and tension that really plays out here. So John seeing, okay, a guy said to do something stupid and it worked. Now we can't even pull the fish in the boat. Hey guys, I'm no detective. I think that's Jesus. Peter goes, "Oh really?" And then Peter, have you ever found out something really exciting and then you go into sort of an autopilot, but everything you do in autopilot doesn't totally make sense? Peter says, "Oh, that's Jesus." And he had taken his outer garment off because they were working hard fishing, not catching anything but fishing. Peter puts his clothes back on to jump in the water and swims to shore. The other disciples go, "Thanks, Peter." And they haul the fish to the shore while Peter's off there not hauling fish. So that's our setup so far. They went fishing. They fished all night with nothing to show for it. Jesus gets involved in their business. They don't even know it's Jesus to start with, but it is Jesus. He tells them to do something that really doesn't make much sense to them, but they do it because nothing else has worked. And when they figure out it's Jesus, they start hauling the fish in. Peter's so excited, he gets dressed, jumps in the ocean, and swims to Jesus. And when they do the thing that Jesus said, even before they know it's Jesus, the unlikely, remember, they've been fishing this water all night. Unlikely may be an understatement. The unlikely doesn't just become a possibility, it becomes reality. They have so many fish that they can't get it back in the boat. They just have to sort of haul the net until they're to the shore. Now, pick up in verse 9. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring me some of the fish that you've just caught." Simon climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus had appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So, when they finally get the boat up to the shore with a net of fish that they're dragging, Simon does, to be fair to Simon Peter does go back to the boat and help them bring the fish in. Got real excited, but responsibility kicked in. I want you to notice what Jesus is doing. Because honestly, hearing this story all my life, I was in my 30s before I realized something about this scene. Up until that point, I heard the story. I heard people read the story, but the picture I had in my mind was, all right, Jesus calls them to catch the fish. They brought the fish in. Jesus started a fire, and they cooked the fish that they caught, and they had breakfast. That is not what it says. What is Jesus doing? Well, Jesus has started a fire, a charcoal fire. If you want to settle the debate between do you use propane or charcoal, Jesus uses charcoal. It's the Bible. You can't argue with it. And Jesus is already cooking fish and bread. You catch that, right? That's what it says. He's already cooking fish and bread. Nothing about where he got the fish, but again, if he can just make a bunch of fish appear on the side of their boat, I don't think it was a problem. And then he says, well, let's look at it this way. Jesus cooks fish for breakfast on a charcoal fire. I can't emphasize that point enough. Then he asked them for some of their fish. But note, he already had fish. He asked for not only that, but he asked for their fish, which, number one, he enabled them to catch. They had fished all night and caught nothing until he told them something that didn't make any sense to do, and they did it. And which he apparently doesn't need because he already has fish. Oh, and by the way, I don't know if this struck you as odd, but it struck me as odd. At a certain point, John tells you how many fish. At what point do you see them counting fish? Especially, all right, wait. Jesus got a fire going, some fish, but we got to count them first because we're responsible fishermen. It doesn't usually take us this long because we don't ever catch any. There's no real counting that happens in the story. Could they have just skipped over that part? Sure. But he tells you there are 153 fish. What an oddly specific number. And there's no explanation given. It's just dropped in there. And all in all, there are about 153 fish. So I've been preaching about this story for a few years, and somebody finally came up to me and said, "Hey, why do you think there were 153 fish? What was up with that?" And I said, honestly, I have no idea. And so I went and started looking. Now, here's what you'll find if you start looking for this. Cyril of Alexandria and Augustine, or Augustine, depending on who you hear say it, both propose pretty complicated explanations involving symbolic numbers that somehow add up to 153. Now, my predisposition for believing that good theology and math are never the same thing, based primarily on the concept of the Trinity. I don't like that one. The one that makes the most sense to me, partially just because there's nothing. Most of the people hearing the Bible stories in the beginning don't have a whole lot of an education. Most of them are illiterate. The expectation that they would even understand that is, it seems unlikely. Very smart men, I don't agree with them on that. The simplest and most likely explanation comes from a guy named Jerome, who's an ancient Christian thinker. And he said that at the time, and he does a pretty good job of demonstrating this, there were thought to be 153 kinds of fish. That's what they believed about the world. That's what they had identified, 153 kinds, at least in that part of the world. That being the case, this catch of fish would have been thought to include every kind of fish. And here is Jesus again with those that he called to be fishers of men. Jerome suggested that this number therefore symbolized the fact that someday all men of all nations will be gathered together to Jesus Christ. Now, is that right? I'm not 100% sure. I like it. It makes sense to me. And whether it was meant to convey that or not, the point that he says it symbolizes is definitely true. And there's lots of other scripture that says that. So, could he have just dropped a random number and not told you that they caught the fish? Sure, it's a weird detail. It wouldn't be great storytelling unless there's meaning to it. But I suspect something like what Jerome said. Now, you could say, but there are more than 153 kinds of fish. Yeah, but that would have been totally lost on them. If they believe that there's 153 kinds of fish and the goal is to communicate to them primarily, then that's the way to do it. You talk into their worldview and understanding with the intention of moving them beyond it. That's what the Bible kind of always does. So, this enormous catch of fish that may symbolize that to these people he has called to be fishers of men, that they will eventually not just fish for one kind of human being, but for all of the human beings, and that they're going to come in, that makes sense to me. And I also love the symbolism of they weren't good at catching fish themselves, even though they called themselves fishermen. Jesus enabled them to catch some fish and then asked them to bring it and add it to what he was already doing. Follow me? All right, let's keep going. Pick up in verse 15, John 21:15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he came to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you that when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hand and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate what kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." So at some point, Jesus and Peter begin to kind of move off from the crowd after they've finished eating. And Jesus starts to ask Peter a question. Now, it's interesting because he actually asked Peter the same question 3 times, even though Peter answers it every time. But this is also, in the quickest interpretation, and most people are quick to jump and recognize this, is that, okay, why would Jesus ask him the question 3 times? Well, the number 3 does factor into Peter in something in the story that didn't happen that long ago. Do you remember it? Actually, they argued a little bit about it before it happened. When Jesus tells them that one among them is going to betray him, Peter says, "Surely not me, Lord." And Jesus tells him, "I tell you the truth. Before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter swears it won't happen. And then, after Jesus is taken into custody, as Peter's trying to warm his hands over kind of a fire, and there's some other people standing around, they start to recognize him as a Galilean and as someone who had followed Jesus, and he denies him. And they do it again, and he denies him. And somebody goes, "No, no, no, I've seen this guy. He really is." And he denies him the 3rd time, and the rooster crows, and it hits Peter, and he weeps bitterly. So up until this point, Peter's been carrying this around. Even with the joy of seeing the resurrected Messiah, there's this thing sitting in the back of his mind. And I don't think it's just the denials, it's the memory that Jesus told him. And he said, "No, no, I'll never do it." And then within not a very long period of time at all, he does exactly that 3 times. So the quickest, easiest read on it is number 1. Jesus gives him 3 opportunities to buy back in because he denied him 3 times. Jesus gives him a chance to claim him. Jesus gives him a chance to proclaim his loyalty, his love 3 times because he had denied 3 times. And again, by itself, that's beautiful. By itself, that's a good enough point. But this is one of the cases where translation betrays us a little bit. Not that that's misleading, not that that point isn't true, because it is. Okay, this isn't an either or. I'm just going to give you another layer of it. You see, in Greek, there's something else going on here. One of our problems is that as complicated as American English is, and it is, if you've ever met somebody who learned it as a second language, they will tell you. We have all these rules that we really try hard to impress upon people and then don't follow. That I before E thing, after C, more words. Don't follow it than do. One of the many things. But one of the things that happens sometimes, and this especially happens with like emotion kind of words, other languages have a ton of words where we have one. I think it's the Germans that actually have a word for the feeling that you have after you get a bad haircut. What's that word? It's German, I can't tell you, but it's a bunch of consonants and not enough vowels. Here, the Greeks had multiple words for love. They would look at us, and when you say, "I love my mom, I love my wife, and I love pizza," they would really, really hope that you meant something different all 3 times. But you're using the same word. Here, 2 words for love come into play that are just translated love in your English Bible. Jesus says, when he begins, "Peter, do you agape me?" Or agape if you want to be nitpicky about it. Agape is this all-encompassing, unconditional kind of love. It's like, if there's a hierarchy to it, it's the highest form of love there is. "Peter, do you love me with this all-encompassing, unconditional kind of love? Do you have that kind of love for me?" And in your Bible it says, "And Peter said, 'Yes, Lord, I love you.'" In Greek it says, "Jesus, I phileo you." Jesus asked, "Do you agape me?" And Peter says, "Lord, you know I phileo you." Phileo means it's a brotherly kind of love. Basically, Jesus says, "Do you love me with this huge, all-encompassing love?" And Peter responds, "Love you like a brother." And then Jesus comes in and, well, Jesus, based on his response, says, "Okay, feed my sheep." Then he asks the same question. "Simon Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me with this? I heard your answer, but do you love me with this big, all-encompassing, highest form of love? And again, Peter says, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you like a brother. Now, here's where this gets interesting. Because I've read people say, okay, the differentiations between this kind of love weren't as stark as you tend to make it. They did use them somewhat interchangeably, and there's some truth to that. Here's the thing that makes me think it means something here. The third time Jesus asked it, here's what he says. So, Peter, do you love me like a brother? Jesus changes his question the third time. Peter, do you love me with brotherly love? And Peter answers, Lord, you know that I love you like a brother. Jesus changes his word to match Peter's. And his response is still the same. Lord, you know I love you like a brother. Okay. Take care of my lambs. Feed my sheep. So what do you do with that? Well, here's what I think. And it may be a simple sounding take, but I still think it. Jesus is willing to meet Peter where he is to take him someplace more. Okay, Peter, is that all you got? What I want from you is this kind of all-encompassing, huge, highest form of love. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I give you. But if where you're at is you can love me like a brother, all right, we can work with that. My instructions are the same. Feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. Oh, one other thing. Honestly, there's going to be more than one other thing, but here is another thing. He doesn't just say, do you love me? He says, do you love me more than these? What are these? Now, the first thing that may come to your mind is probably this, and I've seen a lot of people write this up. He's saying, do you love me more than these other disciples? Do you love me the most out of all these people? Here's my problem. That doesn't sound like Jesus to me. Hey, you love me more than those other losers? No, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't hit right. It's not some kind of, all right, guys, I got a new chant for you to learn. We've got spirit. Yes, we do. We got spirit. How about you? And then whoever says it the loudest, they get a better seat in heaven. That doesn't make any sense. So what are these? I'm going to suggest something to you that sounds ridiculous, but I also think is right. I think he means the fish. Here's why I think that. Jesus has been resurrected. He has shown that he has defeated death. These are his disciples who we've told that they're going to go out, they're going to do the same kind of thing. They're going to change the world. And when they're sitting by themselves trying to figure out what to do, the best thing they come up with is, hey, we go fishing again. Jesus commissioned them. He gave them a mission to change the world. And their response was, what if we went back to fishing? And it was Peter's suggestion. So Jesus walks off with them after they ate what I assume was a good fish breakfast, although I've never had one. He says, hey, Peter, you love me more than fishing? Because I gave you a way of life. I gave you a mission. Why are you going back to the old one? Do you love me more than these? And do you love me with this all-encompassing, huge, highest form of love? I love you like a brother. Feed my sheep. But do you love me with this highest form of love? Love you like a brother. All right, take care of my lambs. Peter, do you love me like a brother? Yeah, Lord, you know I love you like a brother. All right. Feed my sheep. I gave you a mission of feeding my sheep. If you love me more than these, let's move into God's future and not into your past. And then he gives Peter a peek at his future and an invitation to follow. Now, the peek he gives is of the kind of death that Peter will die to glorify God, which I don't have a degree in marketing, my wife does. But just as pure salesmanship, hey, Peter, here's how you're going to die. It's going to be awful. Follow me. It doesn't seem like the best pitch, but for a guy who just had the opportunity to buy back in 3 times after denying him 3 times, who's been faced with the choice of, are you going to move forward into God's future? Are you going to embrace this mission finally that I gave you? Or are you just going to go back to what was? I think Peter was finally at the point where he could choose that future because it was good and the price was worth it. Not the price of his salvation, mind you. The price of living in the way that he was called. The price of embracing this new identity, this new trajectory, this new destiny, if you will. The kind of death he would die didn't deter him. He got to choose it, not it being the most easy choice in the world, but knowing what it entailed, knowing what it encompassed. Now, here's what happens next, though. Pick up in verse 20. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that the disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things, who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have the room for the books that would be written. Now, I adore this scene. And it drove me a little bit nuts because I know I've seen this kind of thing play out in everything from Bugs Bunny cartoons to TV shows to movies, and I could not think of one specific thing to find a picture of for the slide. But you'll recognize it immediately. So Jesus and Peter have apparently walked off to have this conversation we've just been talking about. And at the point where Jesus says, describes the kind of death Peter's going to die if he follows Jesus in this, Peter looks back and sees John, who is apparently following them, trying to look nonchalant, eavesdropping. I imagine him like with his hands behind his back, just kind of whistling, looking. Because it's silly. They're on a beach. Everybody's over there with a fish. Jesus and Peter have walked off, and John's like, doo-doo-doo-doo, just so he can hear in. And so Peter turns back and points and says, what about that guy? And I also love that John makes the point to use his nickname for himself, the disciple Jesus loved, and then reminds you of his important role in the Lord's Supper. He was the one that leaned back on Jesus and asked who was going to betray him. Peter asks, what about that guy? Peter's told the kind of death that he's going to die. Okay, but I hear you, but what about that guy? And Jesus' response is this. What does that have to do with you? If I want him to live until I come back, what does that matter? I'm telling you to follow me, so your job is to follow me. And here's what it's going to look like for you. That one may be a little tough for us. Because we, like Peter, might look at a situation like that and say, but that's not fair. Let me clear up something about Christianity for you. If you're looking for fair, Christianity might not be the religion for you. It is inherently not fair. And here's what I mean by that. Grace, which the whole thing is kind of predicated upon, is unmerited favor. Meaning favor that is shown to you though you are without merit, or whether merit is just taken out of the equation. Also, the equation is taken out of the equation. You are shown favor not because you are good, but because God is. You are shown favor because through some orchestration of something, you at some point made the choice to accept the gift that God was freely offering, which you did nothing to earn. Even baptism itself, you are the least active person in your baptism. I know, I do it all the time. People stand in front of me. I was like, stand here, you're going to be out there. You're going to hold your wrist. That's not in the Bible. I'm just trying to keep you from drowning. And then I have them pull it back, and they hold their nose. And here's what I say to them. You just have to let your knees go loose and trust me to pick you back up. That's all you do. If they try to do more than that, it's a nightmare. You end up wrestling with them. Somebody falls. It's not good. And as a way to start the life of faith, that kind of an act of faith where you are even depending on the person in the water with you to lift you back up, is not a bad way to start. But to be clear, you didn't really do anything there except for say yes to the gift that God wanted to give you. Grace is not fair. Salvation and rescue aren't fair. Fair doesn't even make sense in that context, actually. Grace is inherently unfair. You don't want God to be fair. You're banking on God not being fair. You're banking on God being good and loving and full of grace and mercy. And you're right. But let's give up on fair because that doesn't factor in anymore once you're in grace. Peter says, all right, I'm picking up what you're laying down here, but what about that guy? You know, the guy who's pretending like he's not listening. And Jesus says, it doesn't matter what's going to happen with that guy. Here's what I'm asking of you. Your responsibility is to answer the calling I gave to you. And there's all kind of ways that plays out. But let me be super clear about this. That kind of comparison, that kind of, okay, is this fair? I'm having to do this. What do they have to do? It sure does look like they have it easy. Well, number one, you don't know what's going on with them. And number two, according to Jesus, what's it matter? If God's calling you to do this, you're called to do this. And it doesn't matter what Jesus is calling that guy to as far as you're concerned because you're called to do this. Also, it matters in this sense. Your job is also to let that person and help that person answer Jesus' call to them. You say, okay, that sounds like something I would do. Man, I used to work at another church, more than one actually, but I'm not going to name it. And at one point, it was an all a cappella church. They only did a cappella music all the time. But they did this thing where they were going to start leading the a cappella songs with a praise team where everybody was practicing. There was a team of people. They would all practice the parts, tenor, bass, soprano, alto, all that, with the leader. And then when they would lead the songs, they would all be there. And they were going to mic these people. And as far as a cappella song leading goes, it's not a bad way to go, especially with new songs, because people pick up on the parts. So we started this on like a Wednesday night, not even between the two magical prayers on Sunday, on Wednesday night. And so these people were sitting there with the microphones. They'd gotten there a little bit early to practice too, and so there was this space before we get to start. And this guy I know came up to one of them, not even the leader, but came up to one of them who was sitting there with a microphone, and he goes, "Where's my mic? I have an idea." He says, "Where's my mic?" And I look up at him, and sometimes if you catch me at this the wrong moment, like usually there's a filter that catches some stuff and says, oh, there's probably a better way to say this. This was not one of those times. I looked up at him and I said, dude, you're tone deaf. We all have different gifts. This is an opportunity for them to use their gifts. You have other gifts that we need you to use, but not this one. And we were close enough friends that he got it, but it's so funny to me in some contexts. I mean, not the happy kind of funny, but it's so funny to me that sometimes we feel threatened by somebody else using their gift because it's not our gift. Instead of marveling at God's ability to pull diverse people together with diverse sets of gifts so that together we can be something bigger and more beautiful than any one of us are by ourselves. It's like in your body, you're made of all these different parts that have different functions. If that wasn't true, we would be really weird. In order for the body to function properly, it's got to have all these parts that do different things, different functions, and it has to work together as a system to optimize how all of those things are fulfilling their functions so that it can live. The same thing is true of the church. So all of our trying to knock people down, keeping people from getting a big head for using their gift, that is not from God. Now, if you're real close to somebody and pride starts taking over, and even if that somebody is me, then yeah, I hope you do have the kind of relationship and the kind of guidance from God where you can have that meaningful conversation. But if you find yourself slapping down anybody who has a gift other than yours who wants to display it, in that instance, you're not on Jesus' side. What about that guy is not a helpful question. It's a distraction that pulls us away from our actual calling and mission. And we can ask that question endlessly and talk ourselves out of what we're actually called by God to do. So let's look. Here's where we're going to finish up. Charting our course, we'll look at some implications of the story. Number one, in light of the story, I think that we're called to become open to the new possibilities and power that Jesus offers. What did John, the author of this gospel, earlier in his gospel, tell us happened with Jesus' resurrection? John tells us new creation. John very insistently takes it back to like a renewed version of creation. Whereas what happens at the beginning of Genesis pulls everything out of harmony, what Jesus does, again, in a garden, being mistaken for the gardener. In the Gospel of John, if you walk through it, John only identifies, he's clearly talking about more than 7 days, but he only identifies 7/8 days, where he basically defines a week, names them as he goes through, and then when you get to the resurrection, it's the first day of the week again. It's the first day of new creation. What Jesus is doing is new creation. So what the disciples decided to do, they decided to go back to live like they did in old creation, to figure out how to survive, how to exist, how to maintain the world that is, instead of living the new reality that is breaking through. So we need to be open to what God's actually doing, open to what God's calling us to, open to the things that are beyond the scope of what we believe this church might be able to do, because we're not limited to what this church might be able to do. We're only limited by what God might be able to do through this church. And you can discuss with God what you think the limitation on that is. What the disciples actually do, they went back, they lived like they did in old creation, they just tried to figure out how to survive, how to exist, instead of living into this new reality and this new future and into God's promises as if we believed he was going to make good on them. Also, Jesus accepts what we offer and adds it to what he's already doing. That's one of the implications of the story to me. It's one of the things that blew my mind when I recognized it. Jesus is already cooking fish on a fire, and he asked them to bring the fish that he enabled them to catch to add it to the breakfast he's already making. And in a very real way, that's what's happening with you and me, and that's what's happening with this church. God is already doing things in the world. God already has things in play in the world, and he asks people like you and me and us together to join in with him in what he's doing. It's not a matter of us just coming up with our own whims and saying, hey, God, we really like it if you get on board with this. God, from the beginning, has been in the redemption business, the salvation business, the lifting up the downtrodden business, the bringing things back into harmony business, the light into darkness business, and he enables us to do that with him. We're not called to only go to the limitations of our own resources. What kind of a story would that be? Well, people who are perfectly equipped to do these things did them. Yea, God. And God's quite clear all through the Bible that his power is shown in our weakness because people keep coming together to do things that are beyond them. And because God enables it, they're able to. His power is shown in our weakness because there's really no other way we could have pulled those things off, and everybody knows it. Us and people watching from the outside. And when we try to just limit ourselves to our own resources and what we think we could reasonably pull off, we're frankly, in the Old Testament, we're David deciding to take a census of the fighting men and weapons that they have after God's been enabling them to win all the battles. You don't know that story, God's not really happy with it. Also, Jesus meets us where we are so that we can become more than we are. I don't know how many times or how many ways I have to say this, but God doesn't need you, doesn't even want you to get it all together up front before you engage, before you come to him, before you say yes, before you start living into this way of Jesus. Jesus' invitation to people was not, hey, here's my card. Once you get your life together, call me. I might have a position for you. Jesus walks past people and says, hey, follow me. And they do. And it's not that they're all perfectly equipped for the job. They are not. I mean, just read the Gospels and see how much they don't get what he's saying. Especially if he's using some kind of metaphors, because they skip that day at school. They do not get those. And it's so gratifying for people like you and me to know if that's who Jesus actually called to follow him, maybe you and I aren't that different. And look at how the world was changed by those guys. And useless comparison distracts us from our calling and our mission. Stop comparing yourself to other Christians. Stop comparing your church to other churches. The question that Jesus is asking us is, are you going to follow me? What does that church, what does that Christian have to do with you? You are called to follow me. Your church is called to follow me. So stop looking at other people's budgets, other people's facilities, what other people can do. You are called to follow me. Frankly, stop caring what other people might be saying about you or your church. You are called to follow me. And if you're doing that, who cares what they think? So, may you let go of the past and embrace God's in-breaking future. May you learn to join Jesus in his mission. May you learn the joy of adding what you have to offer to what he's already doing. May you quit waiting until you have it all together or until you're good enough to join Jesus in what he's doing in the world. May you learn to let Jesus meet you where you are so that you can grow into something more. May you learn to quit taking the bait of comparison. May you be free of that useless and endless distraction so that you can embrace God's dream for us and for the world. And may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And the church said together, amen.